we've run an app, come back to the structure of migrations, and we're going to look at the routes. So RESTful routing in Rails. RESTful routing is what's going to map each resource to our particular set of commands to a defined set of URLs that the user knows about. So in this case, all of our routes that we use in our app are going to be defined in config/routes.rb. When you run a Rails generation command, that file is created for you. When we generate a model like movies, those routes can be added to the routes file automatically by Rails, but there is a specific format that we'll look at. And there's a few different ways that we can rate this. But typically, our routes specify a few things. So in this case, we have get pastries / flavor. Again, Ruby hash maps to pastries hash eat. If we say hash, note there are two kinds of hashes, right? This is a Ruby hash. This is the hash symbol as eat _ dessert. So what do we have here? We have an HTTP verb, get. We have a route or a path that the user will see. We have a controller name, a method on that controller. And this, as we'll see, gives us a human readable name that we can use later on in our code. So Rails parses this command, and it automatically knows how to match this URL to the particular action pastries controller with the method eat. Note here, we didn't specify pastries controller either as a controller or as a file name. Rails figured that out for us. This gives us a URL which has a URL parameter, in this case called flavor, which Rails will automatically make available to our code in a hash called params. And what Rails also provides is now an action that takes a method called, or link to as an action that takes a method which generates our URL. So if we say as eat dessert, we get a new method automatically for us called eat dessert path, which takes in, what does this take in? It takes in the flavor that our URL knows about, and it will automatically generate, in this case, a link and a proper URL for each resource that we have. And what's nice about this is all of these actions or things that we'll do multiple times in an application, they follow a similar pattern. So whatever parameters we have in our routes, they'll be available in our params hash. There'll be things that we can pass to our URL generation methods, and Rails will make all of those available. The main idea here is that by following a consistent format, this logic works both ways. We can define it once in our routes file. We have a bunch of methods that will be available throughout our code to use wherever we might need. This is something that would potentially be in a view file. Accessing params hash is something that we would likely do in a controller, but those will be available in all the right places. We'll get into the details of this later, but this is where it's also helpful to mention that for all of these tools, Rails provides really helpful guides that explain the details of what's going on. Certainly don't need to memorize them, but knowing where to find information is really useful. This guide, Rails routing from the outside in, gives you all the details of how you would define routes, how these routes map to actions, and the various options that exist. So it's a really helpful resource. I read it bunches of times while learning Rails. So when we build routes, how should we think about the routes that exist? So we have a few options that Rails generates for us automatically. We specify this with the command resources movies. So what is this here? Resources is just a method. It takes in a symbol, movies, which tells us that I want all of my resources for an object named movies. And it gives me back 7 distinct routes. A get /movies, a get movies /new, a post movies, a get movies /ID, post movies ID edit, put movies ID, and delete movies ID. So these are create, our reads, our updates and our deletes, and an additional method that we sometimes refer to as I for index, a thing that will list all of the movies. Most of our routes, our resources will have a route for index. In each of these cases, this ID corresponds to a database column, which is a numerical index for our action. So I'm going to stop there.